Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our August edition of the Divorce Support Club with me, Claire Macklin. I'm joined today by Sue Ellingham, who is from Walker Family Law. Sue's a partner at the firm and has a lot of experience in the area that we're going to talk about today. And we're also joined by Caron Kipping, our special guest, who has appeared on a couple of our episodes before. And she's joining us today to talk about going through divorce when you are in a after domestic abuse. Um, Karen, as a very brief introduction, I know that you have worked for many, many years as a domestic abuse specialist and also as an independent domestic abuse advocate with the Dash charity. And you now support clients through leaving abusive relationships, controlling relationships. And you also train professionals like me and like Sue on how to respond effectively and support clients through the family court. I think it would be really helpful for our listeners if you could tell us just a little bit about your story, perhaps, and how you came to be doing the role that you're doing, if that's okay.
Sure. So I'm quite open about my story. I was in a abusive, coercive marriage for about 10 years, had a young child at the time. Separating was very difficult. The average number of times it takes people to leave is about 7 or 8 times. It took me 3 attempts to leave.
Mm.
Um, it was a very difficult time post-separation. I would say the divorce was difficult, but it was the post-separation abuse that was the worst, really. So it was ongoing emotional abuse, lots of conflict around child contact for many years, to be honest. Financial abuse, smear campaigns, and um, at that time, this was over 20 years ago now, there was very little recognition about post-separation abuse, about coercive control, very little support for high-risk domestic violence. Um, and so I was kind of left to figure it out by myself, really, just me and my solicitor. And my solicitor was a lovely person, very experienced in family law, but I don't think really understood coercive control. And I didn't understand it, to be honest. And so I didn't really know what I should be asking for. I didn't know the family law process. I was a bit like a rabbit in the headlights at the time. And so some of the decisions that I made at the time probably were not the best decisions. They were made in a rush. They were made without much information. And of course, the decisions that you make at that time have long-term consequences. So, yeah, things were very, very difficult for a number of years. And then I kind of started to rebuild and heal and got myself into a very happy, healthy relationship and had 2 more children and just by chance really started to volunteer at my local domestic abuse organisation and very quickly realised that that's where I needed to be. So
Mm.
got myself a job there, did lots of training and ended up spending the next 18 years working there, supporting women and men going through domestic abuse. And then about 6 years ago, I realised again that there was a bit of a gap in services. So there was a lot of people who weren't able to access any help for themselves through traditional domestic abuse services. And they just needed a more kind of bespoke service from somebody that really understood risk and somebody that understood the family law and criminal law as well. So that's kind of where I ended up. And yeah, and I love it.
Yeah,
It's
and of
kind of
course,
taken me full circle, really.
yes, yeah, really full circle. And of course, you've written your fabulous book as well, which we really ought to also mention, from recognition to recovery, about leaving and surviving a divorce from somebody who's coercive and controlling. I think it's really helpful for people to understand that you've been through this, that you have lived through a similar experience to them. Um, so when clients first come to you, Karen, What are some of the main issues that they bring to you when you first meet them?
So usually they're very overwhelmed
Mm.
to begin with because they've usually been carrying this huge weight around by themselves, questioning their relationship, questioning, should they leave, should they not, how are they going to leave, how are they going to survive, how are they going to manage financially, what about the children, are the children going to blame them? So there's all of these thoughts spinning around in their head. And they feel really confused. Sometimes they don't know how to explain their situation. They might feel that it might be abusive, but to try and explain it, they find really hard. They might be suffering a bit with short-term memory loss and brain fog as well because of the trauma. Um, so yeah, usually in that first conversation that I have with them, it's a lot of reassurance that how they feel is actually quite normal at this stage. It's validating them so that they understand that yes, their fears are, very valid and, and that kind of behavior is not okay. And then it's thinking about, okay, first of all, how do we make sure they stay safe? And then secondly, what do we do next? In terms of, gathering information, thinking about their options, who else do they need to tap into to get advice and guidance and clarity on what comes next.
Mm. I think going back to the point you made at the beginning about people being very much in overwhelm, and my experience too is that people are very much stuck in kind of fight, flight, freeze,
Yeah.
fawn potentially mode. It's about survival at that
Yeah.
point. Um, and so, what kind of strategies do you talk through with people in terms of trying to control that kind of survival, constant high alert kind of feeling that people have?
It's very difficult because if you're still in that relationship, of course, your nervous system is completely heightened. You are stuck in that fight thing, which I can't, I can never say properly. Um, but I think if you start to build up a little kind of support team of people around you and you start to get clarity on your options, that could calm down your nervous system a little bit. So yes, you're right to feel angry about how you've been treated, but I always explain to clients, do not challenge your partner or your soon to be ex, whatever you want to call them, because that is just going to escalate things. If you feel
Mhm.
angry and frustrated because of the situation that you're in, do something to offload that anger and that frustration. Go for a run, go for a walk, have a massive rant to your friend, or to me, but then come back and then have a plan, all right? And
Mm.
think about how you can change your situation.
Yeah.
If you're frozen, it's usually because of fear and, that whole feeling about overwhelm. But if you can get the information and you can understand what your rights are, what you're entitled to, you can have some reassurance that you're not going to be homeless on the street, that you can get some things in place to protect you and to protect the children, then you tend to become unstuck a bit,
Mm.
and that gives you the confidence then to take those steps that you need to take to change your situation.
Yeah.
So it's all about just taking that one step first, and then that building your confidence, and then you take the next step. So you
Yeah.
have to work at their pace. For
Mm.
some people, it might take them a while to have a plan, and they really want to take it slowly. For others, it might need to go a bit quicker.
Mm. Yeah. I think that thing about it's a really good question to ask yourself, isn't it? Each day, well, what's the one step I
Yeah,
could take today? And those steps might really vary. So the one step you might take one day might be to talk to your solicitor about, I don't know, a non-molestation order or something. And a step on another day might simply be to just look after yourself
yeah.
for the
Get up
day.
and have a shower, and yeah,
Exactly.
make sure
And
you
show
eat.
yourself that yes, exactly, that you value yourself. I was thinking about before the session, I was thinking about sort of the pillars of, because it's so important to look after yourself through this period, isn't it? It's so stressful and there's so much overwhelm, and you can get really stuck in that kind of fight, flight, freeze mode. But it's so important to eat properly if you can, do a little bit of exercise, um, have your support network in place, like you were saying, have connection with people, your friends, your family, perhaps, and sleep as well.
Yeah.
I in a lot of cases, it's very difficult to sleep when you're going through something like this. So
Because then
anything that
I
you
always
can
say to
do,
clients, you have to accept your sleep is going to be rubbish
yeah,
whilst you're going through this. Of course it is. Sleep is always one of the first things that, falls away. You might go
mm,
to sleep, but then you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning in panic or worrying and, questions spinning around your
mm,
head again. So I usually give them very comprehensive guidance, a few tips that can help them in terms of sleep routines and homeopathic things that might help a little bit with anxiety and just calming them down. But the key thing is to take some action to change your situation, because your sleep is never going to get better whilst you're living in an abusive situation. It's just not. And I'm not saying that it's going to miraculously, get better afterwards either, but it's definitely easier to have those moments where your sleep is a better quality afterwards.
yeah, yeah. One of the other things that I hear quite often is that the fear that this period of time is never going to end, that it's going to be really long. It's going to take a terribly long time to work through the whole process. And sometimes it can, can't it? So, what do you say to people who are really concerned about, that this might take a couple of years or potentially even longer?
I mean, I can't sugarcoat it. It
No.
isn't easy to separate from somebody who's abusive, and they can try and drag it out and make it difficult for you and make it expensive for you sometimes. But um, you've just got to. One of my clients said to me the other day, I keep telling myself the only way out is through. And that is absolutely right. The only way out is through. You have to grit your teeth and just keep pushing. You have to
Mm,
you know, keep the momentum with the process going
mm,
until you get to the other side. And then, yes, their abusive behavior is still going to continue. Abusive behavior doesn't stop just because you get your final divorce papers. It will still continue, but the difference is that if you can learn to put some firm boundaries in place, you can carry on getting support, you're away from that abusive person, you get some respite, and you can find time and get a bit more headspace and shift your focus onto your recovery then a bit more. And that's the difference. Yes, it may take you 1 or 2 years to get yourself financially and, legally out of your abusive relationship. But in the grand scheme of things, that's 2 years. It's not the next 10 years or 20 years, that you're wasting essentially, in a relationship that is never going to get better. It's only
mm,
ever going to get worse.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I think that all of that is so important. I think that what you've just said there about when you look back, I talk about this with clients all the time. When you look back in your kind of 80 and you're sitting on your veranda, the picture that we've all got, this little old person sitting on their veranda looking back over their life. Actually, this will be a small period of time,
Yeah.
um, and to try and keep it in perspective. But I also really like the mantra that your client had there, because that mantra can also be really powerful, can't it? Just reminding yourself every day that a client of mine said this to me the other day, every day that goes past is another day nearer the end.
Yeah, that's it.
Um, Even though you don't know quite when that end is going to be, every day that goes by, you're that little bit closer.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit. You talked a little bit about support networks. What kind of support would you advise people to have around them, and where can they go to look for it?
So first of all, trusted friends and family, before you separate, you have to keep your circle very small. Your circle probably has come quite small anyway as a result of the abuse, but really only confide in one or two trusted people, okay? Because you don't want word getting out there, slip-ups, etc., to kind of scupper your plans. But afterwards, yeah, tap into all the sources of support that you can. Reach out to anybody that can help you practically, emotionally. We all have friends that we tap into for different things. Friends that can lift us up, friends that will give us a hug and a cuddle when we need one, friends that are good at IT when we can't fix our own IT, that kind of thing. you know. And then you've got your professionals. So people like us, divorce coaches, that can kind of guide you all the way through and out the other side. Legal professionals, financial advisors, mortgage advisors, therapeutic people, people that can, counsel your children. It's whatever you need at the time. But it's really about, not doing it on your own and reaching out to people and asking for help, which can actually be very hard to do.
It can be really hard to do, can't it? And there's a growing movement for there to be support through your employer as well,
Yeah.
I think, aren't there? So it's worth looking at what kind of support might be available as through your employer, as well as looking for things yourself and so on. Sue, I just want to bring you in very quickly now. When you meet a client for the first time in this sort of situation, what are maybe one or two key things that you would advise them at this point in time, very early stages?
Well, when I first meet a client, I get the background as to what's been happening, what the worst incidents are, how long the relationship is, whether they've got any children, what the situation is, what type of behaviours they've been experiencing and the frequency of those behaviours, whether there's been violence, whether it's emotional, how controlling someone has been, what their financial situation is, or the housing. So you get a full sort of background, what support they're getting, if they've been in contact with any domestic abuse support services to help them behind the scenes, because obviously we can do with the protective orders that are required, but it's nice if they've got safety plans in place and they've got people who know what to do and how to support them. Domestic abuse support services have IDVAs and things like that that can help them through the process. Obviously, they've got the divorce coaches and things like that who have skill sets to help them through the process. So you're really information gathering to work out what is needed. Is there an emergency application required? Is there a warning letter required? What steps are required? Where are they in the separation? Are they still in the same property? Or have they separated and living apart, but the abuse is happening on handover of children and things like that? So it's just information gathering so you can see where they're at, what resources they still need. Do they need benefit advice? Do they need financial advice from do they need to speak to or signposting to the domestic support services, basically?
Yeah.
And if they need legal aid, do they meet the eligibility criteria? Does the legal aid waiver apply? Will they face a statutory charge and all that sort of thing? Giving them sort of the basic information so they can start information gathering and the tools to help them separate if they're starting to separate, or if they've already separated, putting the boundaries in place.
Yes. So those boundaries, it's interesting that you've mentioned boundaries and Karen's also mentioned boundaries, and I talk about boundaries a lot with clients too. What are some of the most important boundaries that people might want to think about putting in place?
It depends on the situation, because if they have children and they're getting abusive texts, or they're getting nagging texts, or they're getting texts saying, you haven't done this, you're not doing that, you're not allowing me this, is setting out that I will only deal with this. You're being abusive in your text messages. There are resources available where communication can be done through a website. I can Our Family Wizard is one of the sort of websites that offer that type of service, so that they can, and that has a tone meter to help parents, and it has, calendars that they can share or things like that, so they can deal with things. There's all sorts of boundary setting, like where drop-offs, handovers, should it be not coming to the door? Should it be somebody else helping with the handovers? Should it be in a public place? Where? to make people feel safe and make sure handover is appropriate. Does there need to be a warning letter sent, setting out what those boundaries are and what consequences will take place? Do we need a court order that has to be in place to make sure that those conditions and boundaries are put in place? So these are all the types of things that you can consider as to what's going to need to be appropriate.
Yeah. Caron, I think we both talk about boundaries a huge amount with clients, don't we? And I think one thing to always bear in mind is that it's really important that when if you're being bombarded by messages, for example, rather than ask the other person to stop, actually, because you can't control that, the approach I always take is, well, what could you do differently? What do you want to communicate? So I'm not going to reply, or I will look at your messages twice a week on a whatever day it might be. I just wondered if you had any other suggestions as well, on top of the ones that Sue's already talked about too.
Yeah, definitely those personal boundaries, giving yourself permission, if you like, to not reply. Remember, you don't have to reply just because you get a message. You can ignore it. You can make your replies very short and factual. I always say don't make them emotional. You can get a third party to read messages and to kind of like be a third party on the parenting app if you want to. Some people who are really kind of stuck in a trauma response really struggle to just read emails and things like that. So it's figuring out what you, like you say, what you can do to help yourself. And that may be putting your phone in a drawer, for the afternoon and not looking at it. It could be turning your notifications off or moving it onto a different screen so you actually have to swipe to find that parenting app. It could be, like Sue said, changing the handovers to school so you actually don't have to see the other parent at all.
And it could also be, and I've had clients who've done this before, where they've got a new mobile phone and they've kept the old number just for the divorce proceedings and the communication with their ex-partner, and all of their friends and everybody else is given the new number so that you can keep this in one place, and so it doesn't kind of infect the rest of your communication with the other people that are important to you. So those boundaries are so important, aren't they? And they can be they can be a way in which you can stay as emotionally safe as possible. I think. Caron, what are some of the mistakes that you see people making at the very sort of early stages of the divorce process in your experience?
So sometimes people rush too quickly to make a decision without really thinking it through, or they're expecting the process to hurry up and they get really frustrated because the process is not going quick enough for them. And that is difficult to manage your emotions around that, because of course you do want it to speed up, but sometimes it can be slow and it's completely out of your control and there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to find a way of coping with that. Sometimes they assume that they can't do anything about it, that they just have to accept this is their life and there's no options. They can't afford to move out perhaps, or buy somewhere else, and maybe because of the children, they don't feel like they can leave their abusive relationship, so they I suppose more focused on the negatives than the barriers, which is very understandable, really, because they're not easy, but there are also options as well. So when I can ascertain what they're assuming their barriers to be, then I can help them find the solutions, because there's always options and there's always a way out. It may not be the perfect scenario. You may have to move to a smaller house, you may have to rent rather than buy, you may have to move further away, or you may have to take your children out of private school. Whatever it is, it might not be your ideal scenario, but let's face it, living in an abusive relationship is not an ideal way to live either. So
Yeah, yeah. When we were discussing some of this beforehand, we were talking as well about um, sometimes people spend too much too soon. Um, so being realistic about the financials in all of this. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
yes, I hate that. Sometimes I get clients that come to me and they've spent thousands with solicitors and barristers and and don't seem to have got very far. And maybe that's because again they've been in a bit of fight and flight and gone two steps forward and one step back, or maybe it's because of the ex has been really, really difficult. Maybe it's because they have been a bit unrealistic about what they can manage financially. And that is a really difficult situation when they've had advice and then all of a sudden they've got no money to be able to afford any more advice. And then they can feel really, really isolated, like they're on their own. So, I always say to clients, if you're at the very beginning, try and be really, really realistic about your finances. What can you afford? Are you entitled to legal aid? Look at other options as well. I have clients that act as litigants in person. It can be difficult when you're up against an abusive ex, but you can get things like special measures in court. You can have shuttle mediation, so you don't have to see your ex. There are ways that you can manage it, and it doesn't necessarily always mean that you are not going to get the right outcome just because you're a litigant in person. You have to choose the route that is right for you financially and emotionally, I would say.
Mm, yeah. We talked a little bit earlier, or we've mentioned a few times, the concept around how to stay safe. Um, and we were talking a little bit before the session about how sometimes if there hasn't been any physical violence to date at this point, that people can sometimes assume that that isn't going to happen, but sometimes it does, and this is a real trigger point, isn't it? The sort of early stages of separation, I think it's the first 3 months, isn't it? Is a real trigger point for staying safe. So what tips would you give to people to make sure that they are able to stay safe uh, in their home or out and about?
So first of all, it is really about planning. It's
Mm,
thinking about who do you need to speak to and how are you going to do that safely. Don't assume that just because your soon to be ex is not at home, that that is a safe space for you to talk, because people can buy listening devices very cheaply now on Amazon and on the internet, and they're super small. They can hide them in plug sockets and in lights, and you wouldn't even know that they're there. So think about where you're talking to professionals. Think about how you're keeping your documentation safe. I have clients that keep their documents in their car and keep their car keys on them all the time, or they have a little kind of safe box that they keep things in and they leave that at work, or at a friend's house or something. Um, it is having a proper thought out exit plan. And that may be an exit plan to try and remove your ex from the house through an occupation order, or it may be you moving temporarily, or it may be that actually neither of those options are going to work right now, and you just have to safety plan, as in how not to react to the abusive behaviour and how to cope better with it whilst you're going through the separation and you're unfortunately having to live in the same home together. So yeah, really kind of comprehensive safety planning, and understanding that whatever your plan is, it can change. And just because you've got one plan doesn't mean that you can't suddenly change it. If the behavior gets worse, if you feel threatened, if you feel intimidated, if you feel like you're being constantly harassed, if you feel frightened for your safety, right? 999 has always got to be the first port of call, really. And again, you're collating more evidence about the behavior. it's really important that you do try to gather evidence of the subtle types of abuse, the financial abuse, the belittling and the verbal threats and that kind of thing. So it could be text messages, emails. You might have witnesses, friends and family that have seen your partner be abusive to you. If you look at coercive controlling behaviour and the evidence that the CPS and the police look at, there's quite a lot of different types of evidence that you can gather to showcase the coercive control, so the subtle tactics of abuse.
Yeah, I know that can be one of the big barriers, can't it, to moving through this process in terms of that coercive control can be quite difficult to evidence, can't it? Sometimes when you take these instances on their own, they don't sound as severe as they become when they all pile up on
Yeah.
top of each other and so on. So keeping that evidence is so important, but keeping it somewhere where it's safe as well is really important too. And I guess you probably have lots of advice around, what you can do in terms of where you can keep it. So you might, as you were saying before, have a box that you keep in your car. I had a client who was doing that recently. Everything was in the boot of the car, and the keys were always on her, never anywhere else. Um, and then um, there are safe ways sometimes to access support, I think, as well, aren't there, through websites and so on. You can go on and make sure that your history is cleared and so on and so forth. I think that's quite,
Yeah. If you
yeah.
look at the Refuge organisation website, they've got a brilliant tech abuse help sheet. Because I'm not a tech expert by any stretch of the imagination, but it's quite a simple thing for you to look at your iPads, your phones, your how to clear your browser history and all that kind of stuff. It is really important because when abusive people feel like they're losing control, it's like they get a sixth sense. So they get a sixth sense that something is changing. They might just sense that you're acting a little bit differently. You may not be reacting in the same way as you used to the abusive behavior. And, that's where it is really important that you try to act normal
Mm.
until you get out. It's really difficult that time to act normal because, of course, you want to say, well, I've got a plan and, I'm not putting up with this for much longer. But of course, you can't because that would really kind of escalate your risk. So you just have to zip it. You have to keep that knowledge to yourself and you have to keep pretending. You have to keep the pretense up, unfortunately, for a little while and then work really hard on trying to get your exit plan moving as quickly as you can.
Yeah, thank you. Sue, talking about coercive control there and the difficulty of evidencing it, what would you say to a client who perhaps is in this kind of situation about the sort of um, evidence that they need to be collecting? What would your advice be?
It depends on what they've experienced. So basically, it's very hard if it's them intimidating it, but it's just basically making a note of what that behavior is, how frequent it is it daily, what criticisms, how it's making them feel, and understanding the impact that the behavior that's going on, the pattern of behavior that's going on, is how it's impacting. So it's how long is it going on for, what the frequency is, how it makes them feel. It's, have they sought advice from anywhere, whom they've sought advice, what advice have they received, logging anything that they can, if they've got a safe place that they can log and keep a sort of diary of the events. So it's all of those types of things help if they speak to their doctor about the behaviour, if they get, it's sort of getting those resources. If they speak to a domestic support service, they can speak to them. These are all people who can help them log information. Divorce coaches can help, but they're not part of the government's recognised authorities, I don't think, or they may be, in relation to evidence of domestic abuse if they were seeking legal aid in relation to children issues or financial matters. So the government has a website of the types of evidence that would support evidence of a victim of domestic abuse if that's what they need. So
yeah,
but
again, it sounds like it's a, knowledge is power here, isn't it? So research, do of course safely, but find out what support there is, what kind of evidence there is, and look up those documents on the government website and so on, so that you can know what's needed.
And speak to your local domestic support service. They will undertake a risk assessment. They'll give you guidance. It can be on the telephone, and if it's a very high risk, they can appoint you an IDVA to help you. And obviously, you've got the divorce coaches and everyone who can give you support is of assistance, basically. So these are the things. But from a professional point of view, if we're applying for protective orders, we need to have a statement that sets out what that behaviour is. And if we're looking at occupation orders, we need to know what the financial resources are or access to funds are and things like that. So that's all relevant.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned IDVAs then, and I was going to ask you, Caron, about, because you are also an IDVA as well as a divorce coach. Can you tell us a little bit about what an IDVA does and what that support looks like for people who are going through the family courts?
Sure. So most IDVAs are attached to organisations like Women's Aid, so local based domestic abuse organisations. So they work within a team and they're really focused on risk management. So like Sue said, they will complete a domestic abuse, stalking, harassment risk assessment with you. It's the same tool that many of the police forces use. And so it's all about identifying those really high risk behaviours. So we're talking about imminent risk of harm here to a victim and or children. And then they work with a multitude of agencies to try and reduce the risk as quickly as possible. So they will connect with police, with social care, with housing, with schools, with therapists, basically whoever it is that can help you reduce the risk. If you need to exit safely, and then they'll support you for a little bit afterwards. And then they may well move you on to a longer term outreach-based support service. So it's very intense support. Usually they'll call you once or twice a week. There are specialist IDVA roles sometimes. So you might get a court IDVA, you might get a hospital IDVA, depending on the organisation. I'm an independent IDVA now, so I don't work for an organisation, I just work for myself, but I still have the same connections into police and social care and things like that. So I still advocate for my clients in social care meetings. I still can make referrals into police. In fact, I did that this week for a lady who came to me for coaching, but was clearly, needing more support from police. And as IDVAs, we also are in a unique position with the family court, because that means we are allowed to sit with a client in the family court, whether they have legal representation or not. So you might have a lawyer, a barrister, or you might have a Mackenzie friend. Mackenzie friends are only allowed to go into court if you don't have legal representation. IDVAs can go into court whether you have legal representation or not. So it's a really unique role and a part of my job that I really enjoy doing, because
I can imagine it's hugely valuable.
We get to make sure that that client feels really safe when they go to court. We make sure they have screens and special measures. We stay with them, stick to them like glue, basically, from before they get to court until after. So they're never on their own. I can make sure that they're really calm, make sure they understand what's happening, make sure they understand the language and the jargon and what's happening next, take really comprehensive notes for them. And also liaise, if they have got a legal team, liaise with the barrister around, what happens next and the drafting of the orders, etc. Because barristers can be really useful, in terms of speaking up for clients in court and drafting orders, but they don't see the clients after court and they don't necessarily understand a lot of the loopholes that perpetrators use in terms of, post-separation abuse stuff. So I know lots of my clients struggle with exactly things like Sue said, handovers, school holidays, uniform, all that kind of stuff. You might not be able to go into the minutiae of detail in a child arrangement order, but we'll try and get as much stuff in there as we can get and get it as detailed as we can get, because that's then going to make your life easier in the long run.
Yeah, no, thank you. So when you're going through a divorce after domestic abuse, it can be a long journey, and there can be a lot of fear, there can be a lot of overwhelm, as we've talked about, and that can paralyze you, or it can make you make decisions based on fear. Perhaps decisions that aren't in your best interest in the long term, like you talked about earlier in your own case. Um, what sort of coaching strategies are you able to share with our listeners who might now be, listening now and feeling anxious and afraid about what the journey ahead looks like? What kind of strategies can they start to use?
So, one of the first things is to start practicing flipping it. So flipping a negative into a positive. So wherever you see a negative, it's very easy to see all the negatives and all the barriers. Try and find the positive somewhere. That's one of the things you can try and do. Trying to shift your focus to the things that you can control and learning to let go of the things that you can't control. That's really key too. And these things are difficult until you keep practicing them. There's no magic wand. You have to keep practicing these strategies, but they do work and they become easier the more you practice them.
They kind of I use both of those as well. They kind of, the first time you try and flip a negative into something where you can see a kind of bit of a silver lining or a break in the cloud, is really hard to do. And the first time you think, okay, what can I control here? It's really difficult to do, but the more you do it and the more you focus on trying, the better you become at it over time. Definitely.
Yeah. Reframing is another one that I use on a regular basis. Because again, some of the situations can feel really hard, and my clients can be really tough on themselves. When you've been subjected to a lot of criticism and you've been told that you're rubbish and you're no good at this and that, it's very easy to be self-critical and to focus on the things that haven't gone well. But if you can try and reframe things and view it from a different perspective, that can feel a lot easier.
So kind of like I always compare this to, if you imagine you're climbing up a mountain and you've got a choice, haven't you? You can look up and think, oh my goodness, look how far I've still got to go, and all these things that could potentially go wrong. Or you can turn and look down the mountain and say, wow, look what I've already overcome. How did I do that? What resources did I use? And how can I use that to take the next steps forward? Yeah. And then you mentioned about being very hard on yourself. So compassion for yourself, I think, is a really important piece of this, isn't it? Not, you've probably been living with somebody who has been really hard on you for potentially a really long time, and it's difficult not to let that sink in to your sort of belief system about yourself. So, I often encourage my clients to write at the end of each day, is there one thing today that you're proud of or that went well, and start to collect all that evidence to sort of challenge those beliefs.
Yeah, because if you can start to see the one little positive in every day, then naturally you will start to find the positives. There's always a positive somewhere. I always finish my client sessions on a positive, because there will always be a positive somewhere. We will find it. Sometimes we have to look harder than other times, but we will always find it. And that then boosts their confidence and it helps them feel empowered, like they can do this. You know, we don't talk about we can't, you know, there's always a way.
Yeah, yeah. And you always have choice, don't you? You know,
Yeah,
we talked about this a little bit earlier. You do have choice about how you respond to things. And I remember working with a client once, and we were talking about choices, and you may not even like all the choices. You know, you may be choosing the least worst choice
yeah,
sometimes. But if you can try and look and find three choices, and you've got real conscious choice going on
yeah,
there, rather than feeling as though you're very sort of stuck. So I think, you know, some of these, there's a lot of crossover in the work that we do with clients, I think.
definitely,
Mm.
definitely.
So we heard from your story earlier, and you know, your story is a great story of perseverance and success. So life does absolutely get better. There is light at the end of the tunnel. So how do you help people make sure that they keep looking to that future, that they can believe that there is a brighter future ahead? What kind of things do you talk about there?
I suppose it's giving them inspiration.
Mm,
Like you say, keeping that hope alive. You know, life is not always going to feel like this, and it's not always going to be like this. It does move on. You know, how you feel now is going to be very different to how you feel in 6 months' time, or a year's time, or like you say, 5 years' time. You know, life can be so different. You know, I have clients that when they first came to me, they were like, "Oh God, I'm going to be on my own forever. I'm never going to be in a happy relationship again. I'm not never going to have any children, blah blah blah." And then, you know, 3 years down the line, they're sending me photos, and you know, and they're very happy, you know, very content with their life, you know. So things can really change. And yeah, you know, I have a support community of ladies. I have a private Facebook group. It's a really empowering group. All of those ladies are there to help and support and inspire, and you know, because they're all at different stages. Some of them have been through it and come out the other side, so they're there to help the ones that are just starting out. And that group is amazing. They're so encouraging in that group, and it can really help people feel much less isolated.
yeah, I
And then
think it really
I have
helps when you can see other people who have
yeah,
traveled the same path as you and come out the other side, and
yeah,
you know, then they're living life on their own terms now.
yes. And the problems and the worries that you have, you know, when you hear the comments and the reassurance and the tips coming from other people, you realize that how you're feeling is very normal in this situation. But actually, again, there are solutions, there are ways of dealing with it. And yeah, the ladies can be really encouraging. And then for my male clients, I have a separate group for them now as well. So they are there to support each other, which again, I think is so valuable. It's not as active as the ladies group, but you know, men are not the best at talking. But they do find it, you know, really valuable because yeah, they can feel incredibly isolated. It's really difficult for men that are going through these kind of situations. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that need for connection is so it's so important, isn't it? Because and even more so here because you're likely to have been in a relationship where your connections were cut off and you were deliberately isolated. So having groups like the ones that you're describing must be super valuable. Could you share with our listeners how can they find your groups? Where can they come to access those
so
support groups?
my
Yeah,
groups are private, so you can't search for them. Nobody gets in them unless I let
no,
them in. So it needs to be a really safe space. I want people
yeah.
to feel really confident that whatever they say in that group is kind of
Mm.
secure. So yeah, if they want to join the group, you know, they just have a call with me and I speak to them and, you know, ascertain that they're genuine and what have you. And that it's safe for them to join because again, you know, we have to be careful, you know, with people kind of hacking into social media accounts and things like that. So yeah, so they just have to have a little call with me and then if I think it's safe to let them in, then they
Yeah.
can join.
Yeah, so we will put your contact details and so on all of the YouTube and the Spotify and everything else that goes out after this so that people can contact you if that's what they would like to do. Um, Sue, is there anything that you would like to add to from what we've talked about today? Any kind of what would be your perhaps your one message that you would like our listeners to go away with?
I mean, the main thing is that there is help and support out there, both professional from solicitors, domestic support services. There are useful websites. There is safety planning. Resolution has a list of suitable websites that provides support for people in these situations. They also have a list of accredited solicitors who have accreditation in dealing with domestic abuse and children issues and divorce and finance. So these are all useful websites for people to have a look at, and there will be local resources. So it's really when you feel you have the strength to reach out. You can bring a trusted friend or family member to a meeting with a solicitor, and with your divorce coach or whoever, you know, whatever support you feel that you need. And then people will be able to sort of signpost you to other relevant services if they feel that that's helpful. So it's when you feel ready, reach out.
Thank you. And it's probably another thing that I just want to highlight here as well is we have a couple of previous webinars that Caron has been on talking to us before. So there's a previous webinar about the family court and domestic abuse where we looked at the family court proceedings in a lot of detail in that session. And we also did one around leaving an abusive relationship. So that kind of pre-divorce stage as well. So if anybody's listening that those kind of things apply to, please do go and have a look at those webinars as well. And Caron shared a huge amount of her expertise with us there too. So I think all that remains is for me to thank you very much, Caron, for coming on and sharing your expertise with us again. It's always really enlightening talking to you, and some of the things that you say are really empowering and very powerful. So I'm really grateful for you coming along today, and we'll make sure we share all of your contact details so that people can get in touch should they need to. So, and thank you too, Sue, for coming along and talking about the kind of more legal aspects of all of this for us. And we will see you again, our listeners, in September. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire.